You're listening to the Potaholics Comedy Network. Potaholics.com.
Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. My name is Tyler Osby.
And I'm Mike Coletta.
And this week we are discussing Chapter 24 in The Ultimate History of Video Games by Stephen L. Kent. This one is called The War.
All right. It starts with a lot of third-party license companies leaving Nintendo. And the first one to break was Acclaim. Mm-hmm. And Acclaim, it all started when Sega Enterprises CEO Hayao Nakayama, he calls Greg Fishbach, who is the CEO of Acclaim Entertainment, and says, hey, would you like to make some games for the Genesis? And Fishbach likes this idea because he's been with Nintendo the entire time, and they have that really strict licensing deal, the one that's like you can only do 5 games a year, yada, yada, yada. And he's like, you know what? I think I'm ready to make games for this more advanced Sega Genesis system.
He's probably also a big fan of money as well.
That is true. I'm saying it like it's all about the art. It's some money in there, too. There's a lot of money to be had in the Genesis. So Fishbach doesn't want to be mean, so he calls Minoru Arakawa, the CEO and the president, of Nintendo of America, and asks to meet. And at the time, Arakawa is in Germany with Howard Lincoln, the vice president of Nintendo of America, and Fishbach agrees to go with his co-chairman, Jim Skoropsky. Skoropowski is how you say it, I believe.
Yes,
and they decide to fly to Germany and just have a friendly meeting and explain like, hey, we've had a great relationship, but we're going to move on and work with Sega now, and we want to like renegotiate our licensing agreement because they still want to make games for Nintendo. I mean, it's Nintendo. Mm-hmm. But they're like, we got to get a better licensing deal.
To just take a quick trip to Germany real fast.
Yeah, just
pop on over.
Yeah, the thing that businessmen do. Just a weekend in Germany. So they go to the Acclaim office, which is in Germany. They have one there, which kind of was convenient. And they meet Arakawa, and they decide to split 2 cabs to go to the restaurant where they're getting dinner. And at that moment, Skoropowski and Fishbach are in a cab together, and then the other cab is Minoru Arakawa, his wife, and Howard Lincoln. Okay? 2 cabs driving. Very important. They're like Mercedes 300s, fast cars. It's cool, right? Well, the cab with Skoropowski and Fishbach get sideswiped, and they get in a really bad accident. And the car is totaled, but they actually come out without a scratch. They're like super lucky, which is really cool.
Good.
And then they say, so then Arakawa and Howard Lincoln, his wife, are like, hey, get in our cab. We'll all just ride there together. We'll scrunch in together. And this is the part of the story where it branches off into 2 different paths of what happened. Because Skoropowski and Fishbach think that they got to the dinner, and while they were in the accident and they were shook up a bit, it was still fine. And they told them why they were meeting. They said, hey, we're breaking our deal. Okay.
It's a breakup meeting, breakup dinner.
Yeah, they went through with the breakup, if you will. Okay. Very classy about it.
Well, now, less like a breakup, more like an open relationship.
Yeah, I guess that's a better way to put it. Hey, I'm polyamorous with other game companies.
I would like to start seeing other people. I don't want to stop seeing you. I just want to start seeing other people. That's all.
Yeah. We want an open thing. So
right.
They think that they say that that's what happened. Now, Arakawa and Lincoln say that Skoropowski and Fishbach were really shook up and never mentioned the agreement the entire dinner. And it was only like a phone call later. They were like, oh, by the way, we want to renegotiate our deal or leave it because we're going to start to work with Sega. And so this is kind of the beginning of the console wars because this is when all the third-party publishers started dropping away from Nintendo. Acclaim was by no means the only one. Eventually, over the next 3 or 4 years, Konami, Tecmo, Taito, and almost every other third-party publisher for Nintendo would leave. There was only 2 that stayed. Capcom stayed and got around the rules by licensing games to Sega, not making games for the Genesis, but being like, hey, we'll give you the license to make a port of our game, so you can do that. You can make 1942 for Sega Genesis or whatever. Also, Squaresoft, another company, they stayed with Nintendo exclusivity through all of the 8-bit and 16-bit eras, which is pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. They never left Nintendo. So those were the only 2 companies that really stayed. Another developer, Rare,
Ooh,
decided
big
to
fan.
just... Yeah, who doesn't love Rare? Okay. They decided, though, to just leave altogether. The Stamper brothers and Joel Hochberg, who we talked about before, they created Rare. They were kind of going to these cons and expos and being like, everyone's kind of making the same game. Like, even Joel Hochberg said, it was quoted in the book, he says, many companies were making 8-bit games for a 16-bit machine. Like, they weren't really breaking the mold. They were just doing the same thing they've always done. They weren't really using the new hardware. So Rare decided to say, hey, you know what? We've made a lot of money on our games. We're just going to take a year off. And they essentially went back to the drawing board because they thought that Chris Stamper, who was the technical genius behind Rare, he was the engineer. He actually found a way with the NES to make a split screen version of NES games on that hardware. Like, the engineers didn't even know you could do that, and he found that out. So they're like, well, if he found that out with the NES, then he's going to be able to take this SNES 16-bit machine and really make something out of it and make it shine. So they were like, you know what? We're leaving, but not for Sega. We're just leaving for the sake of moving on. Okay? So that's the third-party publishers. But I do want to go back to Capcom real quick, because Capcom gave Nintendo a very, very good edge in the console wars. And what they did is they had a little game called Street Fighter II: The World Warrior, which we're going to talk about right now. I didn't know it was called The World Warrior, by the way.
That's because not that many people have played the original Street Fighter 2, I think, because there's like a bunch of different remakes and re-releases. And
isn't it like Street Fighter Championship Edition or Tournament Edition? And then I know the one for SNES was Super Street Fighter. That's what it was called. Mm-hmm. So Street Fighter 2: The World Warrior is important to the console wars because when it was released in 1992, Sega sales were starting to pull away from Nintendo, and Street Fighter 2 just kind of helped keep them in the running. It was one of the highest selling games of 1992 for SNES, and it sold more than 2 million copies. So It's important we talk about it. Mm-hmm. It was designed by Yoshiki Akamoto, who started designing games for Capcom in 1982, and he was originally hired as a graphic artist, but ended up being thrown into game design. Like, in the book, it said he's like, yeah, I didn't even think I really wanted to be a game designer, but then they're like, have you tried it? And then he tried it, and it just took off. So his first game was called Time Pilot. It's considered a classic, in which you fly planes from different eras. Like, you start in World War I, and then you go to World War II, and then you move up, and then eventually you're like in the future and you're flying spaceships and stuff, which I thought was a pretty cool concept. Yeah,
that's neat.
And then his second big hit he had was 1942, the game I mentioned earlier, which was a top-scrolling air combat game where you look down at this plane. You can move it back and forth. It was kind of like a bigger version of Galaga, a more advanced version, moving screen, you're shooting straightforward. I love that game, by the way. I played it at the arcade all the time. It was also followed up by his other big hit in 1943. So he worked on the first one and the sequel as well. He also was inspired to make a better version of Double Dragon 2: The Revenge, which was a Taito game, because he played Double Dragon 2 and he was like, you know what? I could do this better. So he actually created the game Final Fight, essentially out of competition. He's like, I could do this better than these guys did. And that game was super successful. Mm-hmm. And Final Fight was so successful that's what made Capcom higher up executives be like, hey, we want you to make the sequel to Street Fighter, which I thought was cool that he didn't invent Street Fighter. He just worked on Street Fighter 2.
Huh. That's pretty cool. I wonder what happened to the original person that made Street Fighter, or the original team. Maybe they were still there and he just was moved on to that team or something.
Yeah, I've never even really played the original Street Fighter. I mean, I'm guessing this is, again, put it on the list. This is another great topic, the history of Street Fighter. We could totally do this for an episode, and I would love it. But the big selling point of what made Street Fighter 2 such a huge success is it had three things. It had the secret moves, like the combos. That was the first game to have that kind of thing. And it also had two characters, Ken and Ryu, and they had the fireball. And the fireball was like the notorious fighting move.
Hadouken.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So that's pretty much what made this game amazing. Also, it looked really good. It was very colorful. And if you look at the game for Super Nintendo, you're like, wow, this does look really nice. And it also had a whole lineup of new characters. I don't think Street Fighter 1 had E Honda or Dalsim or Blanca, who was my favorite. I loved Blanca. I loved going electric. That was my favorite thing to do. I don't think he was very good at the game. As far as characters go, I think you wanted to be Ryu or Ken, but Blanca was the best to me. I liked it.
Number one in your heart.
That's right here. Even in that weird Jean-Claude Van Damme movie, I really, really liked.
Oh, Street Fighter the game, the movie? And then they made a Street Fighter the game, the movie, the game?
Yeah, it was so amazing. I love it so much. If we ever get to a point where we can just do episodes on video game movies, oh man.
Oh boy, that's a whole podcast in and of itself. I bet.
There's so many good video game movies we could watch. You know what? One I actually didn't even mind, and I feel like I'm going to take some judgment for this from the listener and possibly from you, is The Rock was in a Doom movie.
I never saw that movie.
It was actually not bad, and the coolest part about it, spoilers, if you guys have been holding out to watching the movie Doom with The Rock.
For 15 years or whenever it came out.
At the end of the movie, it goes into like The Rock's point of view, and it looks like the video game. And you're just beating people up and shooting like aliens. Yeah, it actually looks really cool. It's like a really cool way to end the movie, I thought, where in like this really cool moment, it looks like the game. I really liked it.
That is cool. Yeah, as far as video game movies go, we can take this tangent for a minute. I have a soft spot in my heart. I know it's not a good movie, but the Super Mario Brothers movie is one of my favorites. You got Bob Hoskins, you got John Leguizamo, and this was... I don't know if John Leguizamo was like a thing at this point. He may have been...
I don't think so. I think he was kind of new onto the acting scene.
And you got Dennis Hopper, and you got Fisher Stevens. Oh, man.
I can't believe they got Dennis Hopper. It's so crazy. Oh, I want to watch that now.
It's great. It's not good. The movie's bad, but all of these people in it are... It's like, you got to watch it, though. Even though it's not a good movie, you still got to watch it. It's like... Yeah, it's very weird. And it has almost nothing to do with Mario, the game. Like, there's two brothers named Mario, or Mario and Luigi, and that's it, pretty much.
Yeah, and they're plumbers, and that's pretty much the only connection you got, right?
You got King Koopa, which is played by Dennis Hopper. They go to, like, an alternate dimension where dinosaurs never died, and they took over the planet, and they're, like, human It's weird. But it's got Yoshi with this, like, puppet... raptor thing.
Oh yeah, I forgot about Puppet Rapper Yoshi.
Yeah,
I'm into it.
Yeah,
I'm still into it. I bet you I'd love it still if I watched it now.
It's fun. It's very fun, even though it's bad. But anyway, video game movies.
Video game movies. Hey, you know what? Tweet us your favorite video game movie because we left a lot there. I think
I think so.
I want to say some, but I'm not going to because I want you to tweet them at us. Okay, the game Street Fighter 2: The World Warrior was released to arcades in 1991. This is the arcade version of the game. And it actually ended up revitalizing the arcade industry a bit. It's estimated they sold more than 60,000 arcade units worldwide. And arcade owners actually bought multiple machines and lined them up together because the game was so popular. And according to the book, that really hadn't been done since like Pac-Man.
Like you didn't need to buy more than one.
Yeah, because arcades, everyone thought they were kind of dead in the early 90s, but it kind of helped bring it back up. And another game we're probably going to talk about next chapter, I believe, after we're done with the war on consoles. The war on consoles? The console wars. After we're done with this, we're going to be talking about another game that was very controversial that also was really big in arcades. And I'm excited to talk about that, too.
Oh, boy. Can't wait.
So the SNES version was just as successful as the arcade version, and it was a huge hit for Nintendo. And it's important, it's in the console wars chapter of this book because it really was the game that helped Nintendo stay in it, because they make a good point. You're probably going to address this later, but Shigeru Miyamoto's games were really popular, Zelda or Mario, but those didn't come out that fast. Mm-hmm. They had trouble competing because Sega just had so many games, which you're going to talk about right now, I think.
Well, now we're kind of... The prelude has been set, and we're sort of firmly in the 16-bit console wars. This is where my man Tom Kalinske really shines. We should, in the future, I think, take a look at console wars more in depth. There's a really good book called Console Wars that puts a sort of narrative spin on this whole thing, and would be really fun to do a sort of book club style thing like we're doing right now. So we should think about doing something like that.
I would love to do that.
Anyway, but by 1991... the 16-bit systems were all out. The Genesis had been out for a couple of years. It had a couple of years on the Super Nintendo. And so it had a pretty good install base. It had a lot of people who bought it because it was the best system at the time. And you was either that or buy an NES, and it was clear which one was the higher technology thing. But the Super Nintendo was starting to gain. The Super Nintendo held a record for a long time, actually, for the fastest selling game console. So even though it hadn't sold more yet than the Genesis, it sold faster. So they were gaining some ground. At this point in time, the Genesis also had a lot of things going for it. It had time on the market, like I just said, but they also had games. That's the most important thing.
So many games.
Yep, Sega's got games. And they didn't just have a lot of games. They had a lot of different games. They had sports games. They had action games. They had licensed games, back when licensed games were mostly good. And then they had games that were like licensed action games or licensed sport games or licensed action sport games. I can't think of any of those off the top of my head, but I'm sure they exist.
So many genres you got there.
Yeah. And so they just had tons of games coming out. And then like you were talking about, if you had a Sega, there was always something for you to be looking forward to.
They had the hype machine going. They got the hype.
Right. And so because they had that going for them, which is very good. They also went full tilt into their marketing stuff. They at this point they had the Sega Scream, which is kind of a catchphrase they had at the end of a lot of their commercials. So they do the normal commercial where they were probably dissing Nintendo or something, saying something like Genesis does what Nintendo don't, and then they would have there would be somebody at the end that like shouts Sega really fast. It's like Sega. We'll play a clip of that here right now. It kind of sounds like Homer Simpson, actually, in that particular clip. So,
oh yeah,
might be. So yeah, they were really they wanted to cement themselves as the edgy choice, which was big in the early '90s because being edgy in the early '90s wasn't like ironically cool; it was actually cool. People really loved that, and things with lightning bolts and like serious with attitudes and stuff like that. So this was the peak of that era, and the Genesis laid it on really thick. In fact, in focus groups that they did with gamers, they found that teenagers who owned Super Nintendos didn't want to admit it because the system was sort of seen as something for children.
That's so weird to me.
Yeah.
You're like peer pressured into not liking a system.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember like that sort of would carry forward too, because I had a Super Nintendo and I was pretty young when I had a Super Nintendo, so I wasn't afraid to be like, oh, I have Super Nintendo. But like going forward into the Nintendo 64, it started to get kind of like if you weren't a PlayStation kid, you were like it was. You were playing baby games or something like that, and then even further once you got the GameCube came out, people were like, I don't want to play these childish games. And this is my age bracket, which would have been in like middle school when the GameCube came out.
I gotta say, I love the GameCube.
Oh, it's so good.
I loved it so much.
So many good games.
So many good. I mean, you got Smash Bros on there, which was super fun. What was the Zelda that came out for that? Well, they had the Ocarina of Time remake for GameCube. They did that.
Yep. That was great.
Really cool.
They had Wind Waker, which was like
Wind
the first.
Waker, that was the big one.
And Twilight Princess also actually came out on GameCube as well at the same time as the Wii one. Actually, the GameCube version came out like a week or two later than the Wii version, which is kind of funny.
Again, super classy Nintendo supporting their older systems. That makes me happy. I'm into that.
I think that one was because they originally made it for the GameCube, and then they were like, shoot, we don't have any good games for the Wii when it comes out.
We don't got no good games.
We got no games. So they sort of hastily made this game for the Wii. Anyway, so that's where the Genesis was at the time. It was cool to be a Genesis. You were hip and edgy, and you probably wore Jinko jeans or something like that while you were playing your Sega.
Does this mean if my parents, because my parents got me a Genesis, that they wanted me to be cool? They were trying to push it? Is that
they
what
wanted
that
you
means?
to be cool, or they saw that it was cheaper. And
that's probably what happened.
They went with that one, yeah. Because that was the other thing it had going for it, was cheaper than the Super Nintendo as well. The hardware was not quite on par with the Super Nintendo, but it blew the NES out of the water. So being a little bit cheaper was totally fine. And like you said, tons of games coming out all the time. They also had some pretty good analogs for Super Nintendo games coming out. So when we were talking about Final Fight earlier, the Genesis didn't have Final Fight specifically, but they did have a game called Streets of Rage, which was kind of the same thing, only it was like bigger and had more enemies and was like harder. So they if they didn't have the exact game that the Super Nintendo had, they had something that sort of did the same thing. So even if you felt like you were missing out on stuff by not having a Super Nintendo, chances are there was something on Genesis that was kind of scratching the same itch.
I love that. Also, Streets of Rage sounds like a way cooler title than Final Fight.
Yeah, it's way edgier.
Streets of Rage sounds like a sequel to the movie The Warriors. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
I like it.
Oh, that's a great movie.
It is a great movie.
Oh, man. Sega also, in their advertisements, had Michael Jackson at this point in time. Because remember, we talked about Moonwalker and how it came out on the Genesis and on the Master System. So they had all the Michael Jackson star power. Michael Jackson actually also did a lot of the music for Sonic the Hedgehog 3. But by the time
Really?
Sonic... Yeah, he did most of it, in fact. And there's some good comparisons you can find online that are like songs that came out after Sonic 3 had come out that were like... you can tell were sort of the prototype version or were used like later on, or there's unused songs that are in Sonic the Hedgehog 3 that aren't in any of the levels, but they're like on the cartridge, and they're like pretty similar to songs that Jackson would later release like on an album, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. I had no idea that was a thing.
You know why you had no idea? Just because by the time Sonic 3 was out, Jackson was in some scandals and some lawsuits and stuff, and Sega didn't really want to be associated with that, so they sort of dropped their deal with him. They kept most of the music he did for Sonic the Hedgehog 3, but they didn't credit him for it or anything like that. They did not want to be a part of that, so yeah.
Wow. So I was a part of that. I got caught up in that Hush campaign. It worked
That's
on
right.
me. I had no idea.
Yep. Wow. Whether or not you would have thought less of them at the time, who knows? But yeah, so the Genesis was also, like I said, it was cheaper than the Super Nintendo. Nintendo would drop the price of their Super Nintendo several times to try to like get ahead of that. And every single time the Super Nintendo went down in price, the Genesis went down in price too, so it was always cheaper.
Sega is just a marketing machine.
Yeah. They were monsters in the early 90s, and I cannot wait to talk about Console Wars because that book is so good and like really, really goes in depth on the kinds of things that they did to get ahead of Nintendo. They were kind of this scrappy startup, especially in the United States, that like really did a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, because isn't it in the book? It mentions that it has it's like in a footnote. I think it says that Sega didn't really do well in Japan.
No,
at all. Like the turbo graphics was better in Japan than it was in the US. Than Sega. It was better in Japan than Sega.
Which is so strange because they're a Japanese company. But it's like Sonic the Hedgehog and that edginess was really, really they really nailed it in the United States as far as their marketing campaign went, and I think that really worked really well. I don't know the specifics about early 90s Japanese culture, but I suspect that maybe those themes didn't resonate as much.
I want to say there's a part in the book where they mention how they didn't really do this marketing campaign in Japan. It was really just it was Sega of America's thing.
Yeah.
So maybe that had something to do with it. I would think it was something along the lines of they didn't follow along with the dropping the price of the console and other things like that. Little things that Tom Kalinske did that made it so he could sell like gangbusters here.
Like hotcakes.
Like hotcakes, gangbusters, all those words were selling.
It's also important to note at this point that TurboGrafx just kind of gave up. NEC stopped making hardware. They pulled out of the race. In this world, Mario was more well-known than Mickey Mouse. This is actually true. At this point in time, they surveyed kids and they said, do you know who this is? Do you know who this is? More kids knew who Mario was than Mickey Mouse. And a character like Bonk just really didn't really have a place in this world.
Bonk just couldn't hold up.
Bonk just couldn't keep it together. And I don't know if those games are actually good or not, but Bonk as a character did not resonate with folks. So
poor Bonk. I feel bad for him.
It's too bad, but what are you going to do, you know? I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to talk about CD-ROM add-ons next.
This part was something that I did not see coming, and I had no idea. It was really interesting to me, this whole CD thing. I didn't even know that Nintendo and Sega were looking into CD-ROMs at all.
Yep. Yeah, so at this point in time, it wasn't necessarily a given. Like right now, when we think of hardware add-ons, like a CD drive or something for a console, we think, oh, there's no way. That's just like no one will buy it and it won't work. They didn't know that in the early 90s, and so both Sega and Nintendo were looking into hardware add-ons for their respective consoles that would use CDs. We all kind of know what CDs are, but they weren't new at this point in time either. They had been developed by Sony and Philips in a partnership in 1982. So they, you could store super high quality music on them. They had a lot of great features for music, but because they were a digital storage medium, we could also use them for storing video games. So basically what CDs would allow for video games is just more stuff, more levels, more music, more video if you wanted to put video in there. That was the really big selling point for CDs, was like you could have full motion video in your games and you could have CD quality music, so you could actually go into a studio and record your music and not have to use like the sound chip inside the console.
No more beeps and boops and bop sounds?
No more beeps and boops and bop sounds. You got CDs. You can play full albums.
Is that polyphonic? That's the name of that style, right?
I think
beep
so.
boop?
The
You
beep
think
boops,
that's it?
like
Yeah.
the cell phone ringtones.
Yeah, like those.
Yeah.
I think it's polyphonic. Is what it's called.
Yeah, that's what they
I
were
do
called
like
for the ringtones.
those.
Yeah, and that's what video games were at the time. But now we could have CD quality.
Let's get
music.
into that. Good music.
Pretty dang novel at the time.
We
if you
wouldn't
ask
have
me.
the beautiful Halo singing voice without games on CD-ROM.
That's right. So Sega and Nintendo both had announced that they had CD add-ons coming for their systems. They both worked with Sony, which, as you'll recall, is one of the two companies that developed the compact disc. So Philips was the other one. Fun fact, Sega was so excited and so secretive about their CD add-on that they would not send a functioning unit to the US for Sega of America to try out. They sent a lot of units that were either dummies or had parts removed so they wouldn't be functional, but there were a couple of engineers who were somehow able to procure the missing pieces from one of the units they had, and they were able to sort of cobble it together and boot it up so that it would work. And so they were the first people in the United States to see the Sega CD boot up, which I think is kind of funny. It's so interesting to think about a company that like doesn't trust other parts of its company. So they won't send them hardware and things like that. So weird.
But I guess in a market that's so competitive like this at this time, you're anything to hush up like your secrets. You got to keep your secrets close.
That's
it's
right.
like when that guy supposedly left a new iPhone in a bar, and everyone's like, he did that on purpose. Like there was no way he did that by accident. And it was a big deal.
Yeah, well, Apple worked pretty hard to sue for that one. So
They did?
yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they sued. I think it was The Verge, I want to say, is the publication that published it. They sued pretty hard for it. They were pretty mad about it.
Pretty mad about the cell phone?
About the cell phone, yeah. It's so funny to think about how mad they were about that, and it's like the iPhone 4 is like 10 years old now. We don't care. No one cares.
It was the 4? That was the 4?
It was the 4, yeah.
Oh, wow.
So 2010, so almost 10 years old, actually. It's like, who cares now? No one cares that it was left in the bar. But anyway, it's just funny. So what Sega's add-on did was really just increase storage size. They did add a few other hardware upgrades in there that allowed Sega CD games to kind of show more colors on the screen, and you could play higher fidelity music because you needed certain sound hardware to play these CDs. But mostly it was just a way to make larger Genesis games. Nintendo also announced that they were working with Sony on their own CD add-on for the Super Nintendo called the PlayStation. Two separate words. I think it's funny that this PlayStation is two separate words. But there's a really good story here. Nintendo did Sony dirty here. They were worried about giving Sony access to the Super Nintendo hardware to make stuff, so they quietly backed out of the deal, and they didn't tell Sony.
Wow.
They let Sony announce their PlayStation add-on. I think it was at a CES. They let Sony go up on stage to announce the PlayStation for the Super Nintendo, and then immediately after, they announced that they had partnered with Philips, the other company that developed the CD, to make their CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. Sony was super mad about this, and rightfully so. Like you can't just break up with somebody in your own head and then show up to the dance with someone else and not tell them. That's not cool. You gotta call that stuff out before it happens. You gotta break it off nice and clean. So you know what I mean? So nobody embarrasses themselves like Sony did. And that would prove to be a pretty big deal for Nintendo because Sony kept working on the PlayStation.
I wonder if that will lead anywhere.
We'll see. I think we'll probably talk about that in the future. We'll give you an update, on the PlayStation situation. One other thing I want to talk about here is a lot of episodes ago we talked about like a hardware device called the Nemo, that company that made Night Trap and Sewer Sharks. Remember?
That's right.
For their Nemo thing that they never quite got off the ground because they just couldn't get it to a place where they could sell it. But they still had Night Trap and Sewer Sharks, and they still had these games lying around. And Sega needed games that took advantage of their new CD add-on, so they struck a deal with this company. This company had originally planned to put these games on Nintendo CD, and they had developed them to put them on the Super Nintendo and the PlayStation, but that never happened. So they ended up modifying them to work with the Sega CD. Ironically, Nintendo's system was much better suited for this kind of stuff because it could show more colors on the screen at a time, so the videos didn't look like grainy and weird. But since they never put out a CD add-on, we'll never know how that looked. Anyway,
Wow.
Night Trap, Sewer Sharks ended up on Sega CD. You can buy them now. Yeah, I think I have a copy. No, I have a copy of NBA Jam on Sega CD, but I don't have a Sega CD to play it. Yeah.
Oh man, I wonder if you could find a Sega CD on the internet. They got to be there somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know because the spinny part is pretty. I mean, they
Pretty
break.
old?
So yeah, I don't know.
Oh.
But I'm gonna look around. I think I'm planning on bringing some video game consoles back from home pretty soon. I didn't pack any Segas up, but I could probably find one around here. Anyway,
Oh yeah.
the last
Good for
thing,
them though for getting
Yeah.
Night Trap and Sewer Sharks sold, because that
Yeah.
was like, I remember thinking they were like kind of left hanging, and now it's like, oh, we get our games again.
Yep. Yeah. So that was nice. Even though Night Trap is pretty questionable as a game, but whatever.
By
That's
the way,
fine.
this next chapter, I was like, Tyler has to talk about this. It can't be me. This has to be your area. This is
Oh,
all
yeah.
you. This
The
next section.
This last little section. Remember personal computers, PCs, that we talked a lot about before we were going off on game consoles, where they are still trucking. They're not quite as good at gaming machines as consoles were at the time, and this was mostly because they had limited sound capabilities. Now, there were companies like Roland and Turtle Beach that were putting out sound cards, but they were pretty expensive, and so most people didn't own them, so games weren't really made with them in mind.
Can we take a time out real quick? Because
Yes.
I had no idea Turtle Beach was that old of a company, because I
Yeah.
only know them from making video game headsets.
Yeah, they've been around for a long time. And Roland, too. Roland makes a lot of musical instrument stuff now.
Oh, yeah. I've seen their like keyboards and stuff,
Yeah,
right?
they make keyboards and make electronic drums. Yeah, they're still alive and kicking.
Good for these companies staying alive.
Yeah, it's all good. The real big company in this era, though, is a company called Creative Labs. And now in 1989, they released a piece of hardware called the Sound Blaster, which wasn't their first sound card, but it was pretty cheap and it was very capable. And so people started buying it and games started supporting it. The Sound Blaster even became sort of a standard, so other companies would start releasing sound cards that were compatible with Sound Blaster. You'll notice this when you play a lot of older like DOS games. There'll be like a menu when you boot the game up that's like play with sound, play without sound, play with Sound Blaster. And like if you choose a Sound Blaster, you get all the cool sounds and stuff, which is pretty cool. The Sound Blaster also had a port on the back that was for plugging in controllers, like game controllers, or keyboards, like MIDI controllers that would allow you to play music and stuff on them. So a lot of people would plug in game controllers through there, and that would get them the game controller functionality.
So is this
as well.
the first idea too of probably people using this card help people like record music on computers too?
Yep. Yeah. It wasn't the first card that let people do that, but it was one of the first that was cheap and
Made it
available. And
cheaper,
made it,
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Made it useful. At this point in time, PCs were also getting CD-ROM drives because CDs were really great for storing programs as well as music and video games. So a lot of, I'm doing air quotes right now, interactive movies came out around this time for people to play. They were supposed to be these games that were like movies at the same time, but really they were just terrible movies with terrible scripts, and they really didn't have much game to them. But that was kind of the first sort of stuff that would games that would take advantage of the CD-ROM on PCs.
So what you're telling me, Tyler, is we're not going to have any interactive movie nights coming up soon?
No, unfortunately not. I don't have any of those planned. So if you want to
They're
do
all
that,
on YouTube.
yeah, they probably are. But one game would come out at this point in time that would shake up the industry pretty hard. A game called Myst.
This made me so excited because this was the first PC game I ever played, I think. That I was actually, I think it was not the first one I ever played, but the first one I had on my own like computer at home.
Do you want to talk about it? Because I actually have never played Myst.
I couldn't get past the first like 5 minutes as a kid. I had no idea what was going on. I played that first 5 minutes probably like a dozen times just because it was so big.
Yeah.
It just seems so daunting. You're essentially on an island and it's really nice. It's really pretty. And you have to solve like all these puzzles, but they really don't hold your hand at all. You have to figure it all out yourself. And you can interact with some things in the environment and some things you can't. And you really got to click around. I think I opened one thing because my dad, his like childhood friend, is a long haul truck driver, and he beat all of the Myst games. That's what he would do in his truck, because you don't need online. You could just beat them all.
Yeah.
So he played them all and beat them all. It was crazy that he told me that. I was like,
wow.
what? And
Was he playing while he was
the first
driving? That
part.
sounds dangerous.
Oh, I think because they had to like stop.
Yeah.
I mean, he wouldn't be the first person to play a video game while driving, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's
But
probably true.
It's a really cool game, and it's kind of creepy at times. It's really got like an atmosphere to it you feel really lonely.
Yeah, it had some really high quality music, I think, and some really high quality backgrounds. Like the world was like pre-rendered 3D graphics.
Yeah, the ocean looked really good.
Yeah,
I remember being like, oh, look at the ocean. Ooh.
And so every time you clicked on a new area, it would have to load a new image, and images take up a lot of space, especially in the early 90s computers. And so you needed a CD to store all these things because you couldn't do it on floppies. So
yeah,
it was just a really beautiful game that required CDs, and it was super popular. So there were gamers that were buying CD-ROM drives just to play Myst, and so
it was pretty cool. Like I could see it, especially as like a revolutionary game for PCs, being like, wow, this is like a big, intense puzzle game.
Yeah. It would become such a huge hit so it came out on the Macintosh first, but they would later port it to Windows PC, the Jaguar CD, which we haven't talked about, and the Sony PlayStation when that comes out later.
Spoilers.
I know, spoilers. I got the hiccups. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'm sure our listeners will still love you even if you have the hiccups.
I hope so. The last thing that I want to talk about today is one of my personal favorite games, one of the games that made me a PC gamer, is Doom. So
yeah.
Doom was created by id Software. I think it came out in 1993. It wasn't the first shooter game, so it was a 3D shooter where you would go to Mars, you have to fight some demon aliens on Mars, and then later you would traverse into hell itself and like have to cleanse the world of demons and stuff like that. So it wasn't the first 3D shooter. It wasn't even the first 3D shooter that id Software made. But it took everything about the games that came before it and just improved on literally everything. It had a really rockin' soundtrack that like just had like super cool electric guitars. It had really cool graphics for the time. It was 3D, so you could move forward and backwards. It was a first-person shooter game, which was like, this is 90s, remember? So it was super edgy, and there was like all kinds of like satanic imagery and stuff like that in the game. So like if you were a kid in the 90s and you wanted to rebel, like this was a really cool way to do that. It
was meant for you.
Yeah, that's right. It moved super fast. It was super violent, and I fell in love with it, and I played so much of the original Doom and then Doom 2 as well. What's really cool about Doom was the way it was distributed. So the way I played a lot of Doom actually was through this system. So they used a system called shareware, which is a type of giving away software. So what they would do is they would give away like the first mission or the first episode of a game. Games that were released on shareware would do this. And then the hope was after playing through the first level of the game or the first however long, you would love it so much that you would contact the developer and you would want to buy the game from them. The cool thing about shareware was, like its name implied, it was like sort of shared through people, like through floppy disks or through whatever. You could download it from the internet. It was totally okay to copy it and give it away, because that was the whole point, was they wanted it to spread as fast as possible, and they wanted people to play it as much as possible so that they would buy the rest of the game. And so I have since played like every episode of a Doom game, but I played that first episode of the first Doom so much because I had the free version. Because
the shareware disc?
Yeah, because there was no way I was going to get my mom to buy me Doom. If she looked at a game called Doom, that would have been the end of it.
Oh, yeah, my mom too.
Yeah.
We couldn't play Mortal Kombat, which we're going to talk about next month. But next week. But yeah, I totally get it. I never got to play Doom. I think I played it at an uncle's house once, and then my mom saw me playing it, and she's like, "You need to stop playing this game."
Yeah, it's definitely not suitable for children. But man, I had so much fun playing that game and like finding mods for it. And then later on, in like after the game was like well past its expiration date, there were lots of like modified versions of the game that would add features and would give you a whole new thing to play through. And like, man, it was so fun. Doom also
cool.
was one of the first like multiplayer networking video games that was really popular, and it had a game mode called Deathmatch where you would, instead of hunting down demons and killing them, you would hunt each other down and shoot each other, which was really novel at the time because people didn't play a whole lot of multiplayer games on PC at the time. So
They started it. They started the trend.
So Doom. Oh, man, I love Doom. Listeners, if you haven't played the newest Doom, the one that came out a couple of years ago, you should, because it is so good and it really captures the spirit of what Doom was. It's like if you go back and play Doom now, it probably doesn't hold up too well because, it's a 20-year-old game, more than 20 years old, 25-year-old game. But the way that I remember it, playing it as a kid, is how I felt playing the new Doom. You know what I mean? It was like one of those, like, it really captured the way I remembered it, even if that's not how it actually was. So I highly recommend.
Fun.
Yeah, it's really, really, really good. But that's kind of where we leave here. We're sort of in the middle of the early 90s, about 1993. So still deep in Genesis, Super Nintendo territory. The console wars are still heating up. But Mike, what have you been playing this week?
I have been playing so much Destiny Forsaken that my eyes are starting to bleed.
Oh, man, me too. I love Destiny 2 Forsaken.
It's been really good. Okay, but I have a bone to pick with Bungie, all right? And it's not about the game. The game is great. It's so good. But it just makes me wonder, why did they do the exact same schedule release it's the exact same as Destiny 1.
Yeah.
It's a really good release, 2 ho-hum expansions, a complete giant release that changes the game and makes it super good, and now we're going to go right back in that line again. It's the exact same pattern.
I know.
Why did they do it that way?
I hope they don't make a Destiny 3 because, like, I don't want to do this again.
They should just, it's an emotional roller coaster right now. It's exhausting.
Yep. I only got room for one full reset.
I love all the stuff they've added, though. The lore, the triumphs, the wanted bounty. It just feels like a way bigger game, and it is. And I remember doing a mission, and I saw a shiny thing, and I interacted with it, and I took it, and it was a piece of lore, not on the map, no checklist to mark off. Like I had no idea this was here. There was no thing counting how many of those I had. It was just a hidden thing in the world. And I'm like, it's things like that that make the world seem bigger, and I like it.
That's cool. Yeah, it's got a really cool storyline, too. I played through all the campaign. We finished that.
We did that, yeah. Man. And there's more. There's more campaign stuff we got to do.
Oh, yeah. We got to do get into the Dreaming City and stuff. Have you done that stuff?
No, I've done some of it, but I held off because I wanted to do it with you.
Oh, man. I appreciate
Friendship.
that. I've been gone for a couple of days, so I haven't had a chance to play. But.
You were celebrating the love of people in your family. It's fine. It's okay. You know, I respect that. It's totally okay.
I mean,
Toby doesn't respect it all. Toby the cat is furious that you were gone.
Yeah, he's super angry. He's mad that I was gone for a few days. We had somebody come check up on him, but he's still he needs people.
Have you been playing anything else while you were gone? Because you didn't have access to Destiny while you were gone. Did you get a chance to play anything?
I didn't play anything this whole time when I was gone. I thought I was
okay.
Yeah. I thought I was going to play some Civilization on my iPad. I packed my laptop because I thought maybe I'd do some World of Warcraft dailies. But I really just didn't play anything, and it felt fine.
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to take a little break. I did. So I forgot that I pre-ordered Spider-Man for PS4. And so when I got home, there's Spider-Man sitting on my doorstep. And now I'm like, I got World of Warcraft to play because I got friends counting on me to be ready to do some raids pretty soon. I got Destiny to play because obviously I'm a huge Destiny fanboy, so I gotta play Destiny. And then I got this Spider-Man game, who is one of my favorite superheroes, just sitting there, and everything I see online about it, all my friends, all the reviews say it's the best game ever, and I'm just like, no time for all these games.
There's just so many people tweeting about it. All my friends, too, are tweeting about that. And I'm like, do I need to buy a PS4 to play one game?
Yeah, you might.
I might do it. I'm crazy like that.
Don't test me. Don't test me.
Don't test me, Sony. But cool. Well, I think that's it for this episode.
Yeah.
We dove into Console Wars. I imagine we're going to have more stuff come up later. Like, Console Wars goes over the course of 3 or 4 years, kind of span at the 16-bit generation. So we're going to have more to talk about later. But next week, we are going to talk about violence in video games in the 90s.
Doom's going to be big in that.
Doom, Mortal Kombat. I believe I saw something involving Jean-Claude Van Damme in the chapter. Haven't read the whole thing yet, but this is going to be good. So we'll talk about that next week. And is there anything else, Tyler? I think that's it. Oh, I almost forgot to do our plugs about us.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Tyler's on Twitter at SneakerElf, ELPH. I'm at Micoletta. Also, you can email us at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And if you rate and review and subscribe to us on iTunes, we would love you forever. Also, if you just told your friends about our podcast, we would love you forever because we haven't done any advertising for it because we're just two guys talking about video games history, teaching ourselves as we go along.
That's
right. Beautiful. So with that... Yeah, lots of fun. Lots of fun to be had. And now Tyler and I are going to play Destiny for about 4 hours. So we'll see you all next week. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This has been a Potaholics Comedy Network presentation. Potaholics.com